And welcome back, everyone, to another edition of Going for Two, presented by Home Field Apparel. I am your host, the publisher of the Extra Points newsletter, Matt Brown. I'm joined by my colleague, my co-host, and now fellow graduate of a Big Ten institution, Bryan Fischer. Welcome to the big family.
I'm excited to be here. You know, it's funny because I was always thinking, I was like, oh, it'll be a nice slow rest of the couple of days after we get back from NACDA. Everybody was saying they were going to take some vacation time before the 4th and relax. And I was thinking, all right, well, maybe I'll even get to sleep in a little bit. I definitely did not end up doing that in Vegas for work-related reasons. I should underscore, but
Sure,
you know what?
Never do good.
It's you start getting some phone calls and some texts early in the morning, and you're just like, really, today of all days?
It is. I to underscore that. One, I think I might have picked the worst time possible to get COVID because I not only missed some important details on the WAC Southland, which I will write about next week.
Which is clearly the driving force of everything.
Clearly. Well, I mean that's kind of part of the Extra Points beat, and I was upset that I was sleeping for 21 hours a day and missed that. And then there's this gigantic conference with all these administrators and a chance to talk about things in person. And it's funny because early this week, I had a chance to. I was talking with somebody in the industry that works in conference realignment a lot. I've talked to the other ADs about this because people know that I write about this all the time. And it was literally, this is the dead period because the administrators and the presidents were out of town a lot in June. There's not an incentive to rush through anything in July because of the way that media contracts and the academic year line up. If there's ever going to be a dead period, this was hearing from industry people that work in this world, like it's around the 4th of July. Everyone's already burned out anyway. So I woke up today. I'm recording this here on Thursday afternoon. I'm like, all right, got a little EA Sports scoop that I can go share that's really inside baseball, but those have been performing pretty well. I got a couple other like industry interviews. And you know what? Now that things are finally slow, I'm going to write about cricket. I'm going to write about college cornhole. And I had a couple other things on the calendar. And of course, completely blown up. And I want to talk about this here, but before I get into it, there's something I want to get off my chest right up front of Ben. You probably know more about this world than I do. I was wrong. I was wrong about several things, I think, over the last several months. And I will come clear, right? I have been a skeptic of the idea that we were lurching towards an immediate power 2 or centralized P5 consolidation on this immediate timetable. Over a 3-4 year period, anything's possible. But and this is not something that I just made up, right? This was talking to other ADs. This was talking to television people. There was this thinking here. Big Ten's not likely to expand this summer. That is likely to be a conversation perhaps as they head into their next media deal, because this was likely to be a short-term deal. And then with more clarity about what the market was actually going to open up for the Pac-12 or open up for the Big 12, or when things got a little bit cheaper, perhaps for the ACC. So that is what smart people have been telling me for a while. That's what I've been relaying, this idea of like, there's going to be a P5 breakaway. We're going to go to this 40-team Champions League. And I'm like, that sounds more sports radio than what I hear from people in the industry. And I am not afraid to admit this. I was completely blindsided by this news. I was blindsided by it because I had asked, this was a message board trope about, I feel like 2 months ago, and I had asked about it. And I'm like, no, the timing doesn't really make sense. It's not really an imminent thing. People I knew in the Pac-12 did not see this coming. There was this idea that Cal and UCLA share the same regents. It's part of the same university system. They're not going to break up. There's all of this history. UCLA has been, threatening this for 100 years, and it's never actually worked out. So I was wrong. And I look at the world now, and I looked at a lot of the assumptions that I have used as like frame of reference for how I evaluate these rumors, how I evaluate what power institutions are going to do, things that were, born out of reality. I think a lot of that ecosystem has to go completely out the window today. Like if we weren't already in a brave new world, we definitely are today.
Yeah, I mean, talk about the Big 12 commissioner hire. You would think that would be a momentous time in the industry, and it just gets completely blown away pretty much the next day. And I think that does kind of speak to the changes going on. I mean, and not only are they seismic, but they're happening fast and furious. To your point, like I don't think anybody, just in terms of timing, like that's always the thing that everybody speaks to. Yeah, you could kind of piece together some things. Maybe you heard a rumor here and there, but nobody ever expects the momentum for these things go get that ball rolling down the hill as quickly as it ends up happening. And it's been wild to think of all this just movement and how much more we still have to go. Right. That is, to me, the key thing is this is only going to be the first in a number of dominoes. And now everybody's left scrambling. Certainly there are machinations within conferences and bylaws getting re-examined. And
Yeah.
a move like this, much like Texas and Oklahoma less than a year ago, is going to impact so many schools, so many university systems, and it impacts a lot of companies. And I think the thing that I picked up this past week in NACDA, we'll get into that much later, of course, as we discuss things here with the topic du jour of the day. But somebody was mentioning that this has changed significantly from being a relationship business to much more of one that is driven by some of the hard numbers, by looking at some of the balance sheets, by a lot more business people getting into college athletics, certainly seeing an opportunity to not only make money, but expand the amount of money quickly over the next couple of decades, given the interest in college athletics, given the fan bases that are so inherently focused on their own schools and what that brain connection that is hard to find even at the professional level. At the professional level, you might like an athlete more than you might like, say, the New York Yankees or the New York Mets or the LA Dodgers now. That's how, especially some of the younger folks coming up, kind of look at some of those professional sports. But you can't take that diploma off your wall and throw it down. You're still connected to those schools in ways that are hard to sever. And I think that has been a big change. Is the market itself, the media ecosystem, has seen that. They understand the power of a lot of these big brands like USC and UCLA, and understand that there's some money to be made in terms of their relationship with their fan bases, and with games like this that they're going to get in terms of marquee networks. So a lot happening this week. I just wish it were another week, but we are sitting here and we are dealing with some big aftershocks coming.
It's huge. So just a couple hours before you and I were talking, I was on the phone with Richard Duran, who's the athletic director at Incarnate Word, right? And the other big realignment, news, I say this facetiously, right, was UIW at the last possible minute deciding to stay in the Southland rather than going to the WAC. And we were talking about all of this, and he's like, you can, draw a line between some of the decisions that we were having to grapple with here at this kind of lower level, smaller budget Division I decision. You can draw a pretty straight line to how we got to that conversation through Oklahoma and Texas making that decision. It took an entire year, and it changed most conferences in college sports, places that had nothing to do with Texas and Oklahoma. It shifted the Ohio Valley Conference. It ultimately led to dominoes that shifted the America East, all of these other things here. And we were just joking about trying to game out what this might mean for everyone else. And they're like, that's going to take another year. It's going to be another cycle. But this will, do I think that there will be an impact on the Mountain West, on potentially the Big Sky, on certainly the WAC, which never really settled to begin with, based on what's happening here, and what could happen with the Big 12 and the Summit and yes, like there, and we haven't even begun to kind of try to game these things out here, because the ADs are trying to make these same calls, and the consulting companies are trying to make the same calls. But the timeline for all of that has been expedited. This, I think, a similar thing with Texas and Oklahoma. We talked about this last year. It wasn't that they were leaving the league that I think blew people's minds. That the idea that Texas and Oklahoma were going to go shopping was not totally shocking. When it happened and how quickly it happened was what was surprising here. And to me, that's what the same thing is here too, without waiting to get a real idea about what the Pac-12 media rights are going to look like, or what the marketplace will bear, or even what the transformation committee is going to end up doing. Just like, nope, get the bag now. And that it's even setting us, like, I haven't even begun to wrap my head around what this means on the field, how I feel about it as a fan of a Big Ten institution and how this will change my consumption patterns. Just like it's honestly, this feels like a bigger thing to me than Texas and Oklahoma. I understand not everybody else in the industry feels that way, but while that kind of opened up a gigantic Pandora's box, I feel like this really makes it very clear that we are entering a very different era in college sports. And it is one that is closer to the EPL. It is one that is more corporatized, one that is far less tradition or regionalist or anything else that were kind of guiding principles. I know that that was increasingly not part of the deal. Like, it's definitely not part of the deal now. Like, now we're going to end up with like a Wednesday night volleyball game between Rutgers and UCLA. And we're going to pretend that that's good.
Well, yeah, pretend is an operative word. But I mean, just look at the map. Look at the map. It's USC and UCLA.
You know what? So one, somebody pointed out, this looks like the map of every professional sports league in 1954, which is pretty funny, like ignoring the South. I made this quip on Twitter, but this isn't an exactly new idea. Bryan, you probably know about this, and other college sports history heads heard about the airplane conference, which was like the initial, before there was a Pac-12. This was the initial brainchild. This is what UCLA really wanted. Hey, let's grab USC. Let's grab a couple of the premier West Coast programs. Let's partner with Notre Dame and Penn State and Army and Navy and a couple other Southern schools. We'll move into divisions. We'll play the championship in the Rose Bowl. Make it direct for TV and be like, and that was revolutionary in 1960. Now it's finally happened. And I will say this from my texting conversations over the last several hours, and one that seems to be reiterated by a few other national reporters. I don't think the Big Ten is done, or at the very least, the Big Ten would like to not be done. Whether that means that whether that includes Washington, which it fits the institutional profile of the both market and AAU and sports tradition as the LA schools, whether that means Oregon, not quite the same thing academically or historically, but athletically, financially, everything else up there, whether that means Notre Dame, which is not as difficult to extract from their ACC agreement as perhaps we might have thought. I don't think the final way, I was joking, I wouldn't buy a t-shirt of what the Big Ten looks like now, because the Big Ten might look different in 2 months.
Certainly. I think that is the industry consensus, is that the Big Ten is not done yet. And I think it's important to kind of maybe take a step back and understand that this is much like Texas and Oklahoma. Although there were discussions beforehand, this is essentially the two schools saying, we're going to leave. Where can we go? And honestly, if you're the Big Ten, you can't say no to brands like USC and UCLA, knowing the value that they add, not just to your conference, but if you're an Indiana or a Rutgers, I mean, we joke about it all the time, but those are real dollars that can help you. I mean, just this week, it came out that Rutgers was getting $100 million for facilities improvements from the state. And now if you're saying, well, we can actually get that through media dollars, well, that's a big break for a lot of taxpayers there in the state of New Jersey. So, there are secondary concerns to a lot of this that end up having a wide-ranging impact. But I mean, even in the Pac-12, you mentioned Oregon and Washington earlier there. I mean, those are two presidents right now that are kind of in the thick of things in terms of actually running the league. They, those two presidents, a big help in terms of finding George Kliavkoff and picking him to be the next Pac-12 commissioner. And then now they're in kind of that unique position to where, they want to hold the Pac-12 together, but maybe they only want to hold the Pac-12 together until they know that they have a good landing spot somewhere a little bit further east. So it is unique times for just about everybody in the industry. And truthfully, this has been something that everybody understands. You got to be able to pivot. You got to be able to move quickly. And I think that is the biggest lesson over the last, say, 2.5 years, is everybody's understanding that the old way of doing things is no longer a way of doing things right now. You have got to be nimble. You have got to pivot on a dime, and you've got to continually be looking out for your school, your program, and understanding what might be the right fit.
Yeah. And quite frankly, what might be that you have to look out for your school in the short term. I don't think anybody can necessarily say that this is we know this is the best thing for UCLA over a 50-year period. We don't know exactly how UCLA fans or other people will necessarily respond. We don't really know what the college sports industry is going to be like in 30, 40 years, but nobody at UCLA right now gets paid to think that way. It's just like with a public corporation, right? You got to maximize your shareholders. You got to, and especially for UCLA, which is, in debt up to their eyeballs and actually like needs a cash infusion, it makes sense to grab this now. And that's the same thing with everybody else. Rose Bowl, tradition, any of the other things that used to be, that you would get up there and tell people that were sacred, you can kind of throw it out there. And this is part of what's so surprising to me about this. I mean, one, you got Kliavkoff saying like a month ago, no, I'm not worried about any other school, any league poaching my institutions right now. Hey, we got this handshake agreement that they dragged us all to, we all made fun of them, and they dragged us to this Zoom call where they said they're not going to poach anybody. They're going to work together on sharing a shared vision for college sports. And not just historically, but even on a contemporary basis, the Pac-12 and the Big Ten are really aligned in terms of what they purported to want college athletics to be. Their shared commercial interest in the Rose Bowl, their shared commercial interest in working together. You would think these would be the last two leagues that would knife each other. And that's exactly what Kevin Warren did. And I mean, now we don't even know if there's going to be a Pac-12. Conferences are hard to kill. We said this about Conference USA last year, and they kind of staggered their way through. And there's a couple of different pathways for the league to continue here. But all of that, to say nothing of internal university and California politics, makes this really surprising. That it is not how college sports have worked for 100 years. As mercenary and as capitalistic and as hypocritical as the industry has been, and if anyone wants to go throw a book at me, like, I'm right there with you. I'm not romanticizing anything here. I'm just saying this is really out of left field, and it's a big shock.
Yeah, a big shock to the system that, like we keep saying, is going to continue to reverberate all the way down the totem pole. I mean, honestly, nobody's really certain in terms of what college athletics really looks like. I mean, they're hopeful for the future, but there are lawsuits out there that could deem players employees. Like that is a big threat that I know a lot of people have talked about quite a bit. If college athletics, this ecosystem is now College Athletics Inc. and split off separately from university, how will that change things? Will that be the next move, next big domino? I mean, Jack Swarbrick said it might take till the 2030s to get there. Well, maybe not even. We won't even have to wait till then, right? This is some of those moves that you could say, what, maybe it goes even faster, which
2 years.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, you look at some of the transformation topics, the big discussion this past week about what the transformation can, like, people, there's a board meeting today on Thursday,
yeah, and it's so hard to like
news, and it's going to be like, that is the third thing on the agenda today.
Listen, like, I made my career on the nitty gritty. Nobody fucking cares about scholarship limits now. Like all that stuff is completely out the door. And it's funny, like I actually have an open tab here. The Swarbrick's remarks, this was at the end of April, and I remember writing, I didn't think that the breakup of Division I was inevitable. I didn't think that what Swarbrick was writing about here was destined to absolutely happen. I was arguing that I don't think you necessarily needed to consolidate these leagues to still have championship access, and you didn't necessarily need to have the same amount of money for championship access. And I remember when I published that, like, the pushback I got was not from the industry, and yet here we are. I mean, like, late April, and he was saying 2030s. Now, like, I think all bets are off. I want to talk about this from both a competitive standpoint, and I also want to talk about this from the fan standpoint, before we kind of get into everything else here, big picture. But very quickly before we do, because I know I'll probably end up going on some other kind of rant again. Let me just quickly highlight our dear friends at Home Field Apparel. They make comfortable, officially licensed, unique, vintage collegiate apparel. They just came out with an excellent new collection celebrating Washington State. They are this week celebrating long-time and important institutional Big Ten member, Nebraska. And there's a whole bunch of cool things you could do with vintage Corn Cup people, right? They make Extra Points shirts. I'm still wearing the old logo with the Bagman, which feels particularly apropos given what we're talking about now and the important desire to secure the bag. But if you want to go contemporary, they have USC, and they have UCLA, and they have Appalachian State, which, I mean, shit, by the time we finish this episode, maybe App State's in the Big Ten. I don't know anymore.
It could be in the SEC, right? It's not just the Big Ten that's expanding.
It's going to be everything. The dude of West Virginia and the weirdest conference realignment Twitter people were right. The experts were wrong. Up is down. Cats, dogs, joining conferences together to play a championship game against pigeons. Who knows? The only thing we can count on in these turbulent times is home field apparel. And you can use promo code extra points to save 15% off your order to get comfortable, unique, interesting t-shirts, hoodies, doggers, all other manner of collegiate apparel. Quickly, I would like to talk about what this means just competitively, like setting aside the existential stuff. And I'm going to, we'll make some phone calls and make charts and try to game out what this might look like for a couple other places. But just from the strength of the product, what do you think this change means for the Big Ten or the Pac-12?
Well, it means a whole lot to the Pac-12. I mean, you're talking about your flagship brands, not just in football, but men's basketball. Like truly, the true flagship brands of the Pac-12 are now no longer there, and they have been for not just the last couple of years. Yes, they've had their dips certainly recently, but historically, I mean, this is a huge part of that Pac-10 going back Pac-12 identity. I mean, it's crazy to think that everybody was talking when Riley came out to USC, he was going to be the savior for the Pac-12, right? He was going to restore USC and that flagship brand on the West Coast and really be able to lead that conference and help it on the media rights table to where it lifts all those brands up. And now that is no longer the case. Having UCLA basketball back in the Final Four recently, I mean, it's wild to think that is not going to be the case anymore, that they're going to be adding them to play Ohio State and Michigan in hoops, and obviously the ramifications on football are well known. But these are also two schools that have almost over 200 national championships between the two of them, nearly 250 if my math would come to me in terms of the actual total number that each school has. But this is a big move for volleyball. This is a big move. These are two great baseball, softball brands. This is a huge thing for the Big Ten and really their Big Ten media rights partners to add additional windows where you can showcase brands out east in the West Coast, showcase West Coast brands out east. And I think it means a lot, certainly to the Pac-10 or Pac-12 more than anything. But it's going to be interesting to see, because we don't know this is the final move, right? There could be travel partners that USC and UCLA join. Maybe it is Washington, like you mentioned. Maybe it is Oregon. Maybe it is somebody else that we're not even thinking of.
Yeah. Real quick, it is funny to think about Seattle and Los Angeles as travel partners when that's still like 1,500 miles away.
Yeah, it's a good 2.5-hour flight. And it's funny. I was chatting with somebody, the other day at NACDA. It's just like, how are you dealing with flight prices rising so much right now? That is a big concern for a lot of ADs. Now you're having to throw in cross-country travel like this. I mean, it almost makes sense now for some of these schools to go out and literally buy a private jet so they can control some of the travel costs. They will certainly have the money to do that going forward, given some of the payouts they're going to get. But
it is enormous. Yeah, it is really, truly enormous in so many of those other sports. Talk about a huge boost to Big Ten baseball, which has mostly sucked outside of, one really good year for Michigan, and Maryland and Nebraska have occasionally elevated that brand a little bit. Here are two programs that care a lot. Big Ten softball is going to get a hell of a lot better, which is great. But you're not just taking away fans that would buy tickets at all of these other events. You're not just taking some of your flagship football properties. I mean, which, for being honest, the last decade, the best football in the Pac-12 has not been played in Los Angeles. And many of the best players in the Pac-12 footprint have not been staying in Los Angeles. And that's even been true on the basketball side. But financially, all of that, it's backbreaking. And if Oregon and or Washington, or quite frankly, one of the Bay Area schools leave, then it's hard for me to see how you rebound from any of that. I can just say, as a fan of a Big Ten institution, and as somebody who's grown up watching a lot of that inventory, those games. I mean, the idea of Ohio State, UCLA football is pretty cool. The idea of watching Michigan and USC or Penn State or some of these programs, or some more regular season games in the Rose Bowl, it's pretty cool. The fact that it will mean fewer games between historic Big Ten opponents, I think, sucks, and which we've talked about before. If you live in Chicago and you're hoping to see like your alma mater come through, well, the bigger your conference is, the less likely that is that's going to happen. And also, guys, there are logistical problems with being a coast-to-coast conference. If you are trying to occupy, multiple TV windows, if you're in California and you're in New Jersey, That means that sometimes your East Coast team is tipping off at 8 o'clock at night local in Los Angeles. This is what happens with the NBA, which means that if you're like a Knicks fan, sometimes you're going to play the Lakers and the game's going to go on way past your bedtime and you're going to sleep because you're an old. And that you can mitigate that a little bit in college sports when you're in more localized time zones. You can't do that if you're East Coast and Pacific Coast. So that means if you're a fan of UCLA football, get ready for some 9 a.m. local football games to get the body clock smacked out of you, because that will be your life.
Well, who was the first Pac-12 team to experiment with those 9 a.m. kickoff games? It was USC. So they have some experience, right?
Yeah, that's going to be a thing, and there's going to be Big Ten basketball that finishes past midnight locally, which sucks. And I mean, I realize that it's almost a joke to point this out, and I realize that anybody that's going to get up there in front of a microphone in a couple of days and lie about this, we should make fun of them for it, but. On no planet is this a good idea to help the college athlete experience. That is so much travel. If you're going to move every single one of these sports, except for apparently beach volleyball, which, okay, you're going to be sending a bunch of volleyball players and softball players, anybody that competes midweek on cross-country flights, and then sit there and lie and say that that's good for missing class or for academic achievement or injury management. Like, that's horseshit. Like, there's no other way around it. You're going to make $100 million, and maybe you use that to buy some more trainers, or maybe you end up using that to directly pay athletes. But there's a lot of negative externalities that come from this. Forget tradition for a second. Forget what it means if you're a Washington State or a Colorado or a Utah fan, because you might be screwed. Like Utah, I hate to break it to you, you might end up in a league with BYU again in 9 months, as much as you complained about that. But it sucks for fans, and it sucks for anybody that has to get on one of those airplanes.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think it is interesting to see the kind of the fan perspective and how it probably varies, quite a bit in terms of the dichotomy between USC and UCLA fans. These are two very, very separate fan bases, although they do intermingle there in Los Angeles. Like they're different. Obviously USC is a private school, much smaller than UCLA. They're both very, highly selective. They have some unique alumni out there. And I think the USC fans, especially the diehard football fans, probably this move is a lot more appealing to them than, say, the diehard UCLA football fan. And I would say even right. The inverse is going to be true on the basketball side. So that to me is something that I don't think either athletic department, they did have some, probably feeling out amongst some fans, what do you think about this? But it's just such a wild move to kind of comprehend as it becomes official. But we can get to those down in the future, because this we don't know if this is certainly not just the only move that the Big Ten is going to make. This is not the current iteration of the future that we're looking at, right? This is obviously, this could be the precursor. This could be the fact that this might not be talking about 9 conference games in football. Maybe you only have 1 non-conference opponent when you're playing 10.
You might.
10 or SEC football games, right? That would be a tremendous driver of media rights, and maybe at the end of the day, in addition to playing those additional conference games, maybe in terms of competing for the national championship or the national college football playoff, you're talking about the best of the Big Ten versus the best of the SEC. There is no, as it stands now, come 2025, there is no postseason structure in college football. That is important to keep in mind. That was reiterated to me by somebody in the SEC just recently, is that there's a blank check and there's a blank piece of paper sitting there in 2025. And while the presidents and the CFP board of managers, that was going to be their focus over the next 8 to 9 months with the aim of something happening next summer, well, now that aim might be a little bit different, considering who is involved in those discussions right now.
Man, that's a great point. I got to be honest here. One, we didn't even get a chance to talk about NACDA. We didn't even get a chance to talk about NCAA transformation stuff or anything independent of this. I also know that both of us are running up here on hard stops. So if you are listening to this and you're like, I need more analysis of what just happened, I'm going to write that up on Extra Points, which you can find at extrapointsmb.com. This is not going to be a newsletter where I'm just throwing in the podcast. There's going to be a bunch of extra, digs into this. Bryan, we're going to have to talk next week, I think, about all of the other administrative stuff, which I think is super important, just because our world got blown up. I wanted to talk about the video game today. I wanted to talk about silly things. We don't get to do that right now. You can also.
I wanted to talk about it too. I mean, I interviewed the CEO of CLC. Speaking of the video, had some interesting stuff to say that'll be on Collegiate Sports Connect in the near future. Talk with Julie Cromer of the D1, one of the co-chairs with Greg Sankey of the D1 Transformation Committee. Which again, I mentioned it earlier. You know, there's a board meeting that there will be news on that coming out on Thursday as well. Likely right after USC and UCLA made their moves official. So. It's wild to think, you know, you have all those conversations and then you can just throw it right out the window, given the news out of Los Angeles this week.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of interesting stuff on Collegiate Sports Connect that was dropped over the past several days, and they're still editing and adding some more of those long conversations with various athletic directors and not just the CLC, but others in the industry there as well. Finally, last note, if you enjoyed this show, 5 stars on Spotify. 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, 5 stars wherever you find everything here. I do have to rush very quickly because I have a source calling, and I think you probably have some people calling too, so trying to figure out what the hell just happened. But in the meantime, everyone, thank you so much for all of your support. We'll see you on the internet again very soon.